Well, we got the music all queued up just like a professional podcasting crew would. Welcome to Rec Poker. I'm Jim Reed, Bluff Storini in the home games, and this is our forums edition of the Rec Poker podcast, brought to you by website AMP, Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack and Casino, and Learn Pro Poker. I'm joined by the panel just like every week. Some of us are playing in the Rec Poker home game, trying to take chips away from each other in the play money game on PokerStars. Some of us are just here to talk poker like we do every week. Chris Jones, tell us a little bit about where we can find you.
I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5x5 pretty much anywhere, Twitter, PokerStars, and on the forums.
I'm John Somsky, and I'm Poker Geek MN everywhere.
I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Radman50 everywhere.
And we're joined again this week by Eric Jin, one of our favorite forum posters. It is the forums edition after all. And so every week we take one post from the forums. We talk about it here with the panel. And we've invited Eric to join us this week. Eric, what's your handle in the panel, in the forums, and what can people look for if they're playing up against you in the home game?
This is Eric Jin. I am Binkley in the forums, and I'm COM Binkley in the PokerStars home games.
Thanks for joining us, Eric. And one of these days, we'll get you to tell everyone the story about how you got COM on the front of that handle through your epic gaming history. One of my favorites. So here we are. We started a new group at Rec.Poker, actually. And one of the fun things that we do with the website, it's got groups for people with particular interests. So those can be regional things. There's a group here just for Rec Poker players from Canada. There's a group for people that like to play at Running Aces. There's a group for people that like watching the NFL. And one of the groups that we just opened is for solvers only. So this is just for people to talk about using solvers, PO, GTO plus, whatever it is that gets you going. So I've pulled a forum post out of there. This one's by Monkey System, who we have already spoken about one of Monkey System's posts earlier about Mystery Player M and their aggressive betting style out of position. And as you can see, as you'll learn here shortly, Monkey System likes talking about these wide ranges. So this one is about C-bets. So the post is 100% C-bets. Is this a bad leak? And Monkey System says, Greg Raymer, in the book he published last year, recommends always c-betting a flop in heads-up pot. And my first reaction was, say what? So I ran this scenario in GTO Plus, node locking V at 100% c-bet frequency in several different flop textures. With GTO Plus calculating the optimal response, our EV never increased by anything that made it seem worth the effort to implement it. I couldn't come up with any exploits that increased our equity by enough to justify the risk of counter exploitation. It feels like a 100% c-bet frequency is a highly exploitable leak, but I couldn't find the exploits in a solver analysis. Does anyone have any suggestions? Is Raymer onto something here? So before I go into the comments in the panel, or in the forum, what do people think about this just generally? Is a c-betting 100% an exploitable leak?
Yes.
I think you're right, Chris. Thanks for joining us, everyone. It's been a great week in the Rec Poker Podcast Forums edition.
See you later, Jim. Nice job.
Hi, everyone.
So just in case people wanted to get a little in your head there, Chris, are there some reasons why you think maybe 100% is too high a frequency?
I mean, I think that ultimately when we're looking at c-betting, we really, and I think this is something that sort of has shifted in the game relatively recently, where we're really starting to look at the range analysis and flop texture of like who has the range advantage based on this flop, and that is often when we have the lead and when we're in position, there's often boards that favor us, but there's clearly boards that do not favor us. And if we have a competent opponent, if we are c-betting 100% of the time, they're going to eat us alive. So like the boards that I'm thinking about are like a 7-4 deuce or a 7-4-4 type flop, and we opened from middle position and had a big blind sort of come along with us or something like that. If we c-bet what are we going to do? And we see bet with our hand, like our ace kings and our ace queens and our ace jacks and our king queens and all those sort of Broadway cards, which are going to be, not exclusively the entirety of our range, but are going to make up a large portion of the kinds of hands that we're opening. What are we going to do when a competent opponent check raises us on a 7-4-4 board? And with our ace jack of diamonds with, no diamond on the flop, what are we going to do? We're going to fold. And so we should be, at least. And so we should be, those are the kinds of boards that we should be checking. And they're the kind of boards that we want to navigate towards rather than continually c-bet. And those are the boards we can be taken advantage of. I don't know if everyone agrees. That's my take.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Well, I posted on this one subject too, and I quoted, what we've been studying in the book study and Matt Matros. One of the things that we're not really clear about, he said in a heads-up pot, you should c-bet 100% of the time, but with the initiative, and what Matt Matros says, it's not a huge mistake to c-bet 100% of the time with the initiative in a heads-up flop, because the amount of time that, especially the player pools that we're playing against, and again, we're looking at Matt Matros's, the game plan is geared towards less sophisticated players. So I think players not as sophisticated maybe as Chris is, when he's thinking of the things that Chris is thinking about, the caller's range and where they stand and their ability to actually pull the trigger and exploit us by check raising. Are they going to do that without a hand? Just because they know we're c-betting 100% of the time? 100% of the time, we're not going to have that. We're going to be probably good 60, maybe 70% of the time at the most. And so they know that 30% of the time we have nothing. And so are they willing, are they going to be able to exploit us enough to make it a bad decision to c-bet 100% of the time?
Yeah, I will say I agree with that. Like, if we have an opponent who we read or kind of have determined that basically they're kind of fit or fold or they're hit or miss or whatever, and they're not going to fight back with anything unless they've hit a flop. And what I mean by hit a flop is not necessarily that they've even just hit a pair, but that they've either hit a pair, something stronger, or a strong draw. I wouldn't say gut shots even. Like, if they're going to fight back with gut shots, then I think we're starting to even be in some trouble here. But those opponents, I think we can c-bet pretty liberally. Like, we can just kind of c-bet whenever we feel like it, because we're going to really take them down enough and they're not going to fight back enough. But if there's any players that are capable of looking at a board and saying, even if it didn't hit me, it should have hit me more than it should have hit you, then we've got to be a lot more careful, and we've got to pick our spots to c-bet.
And when we talk about how other players could exploit higher c-betting range, there's a few different ways that they could do it. It depends on if you're in position or out of position. But if I'm playing against someone who I think is c-betting too much, I mean, the obvious exploit is to start raising them, whether they're check raises or raises in position, with a mix of hands that makes their life difficult on the calling side. You're putting them in kind of the same position that they're hoping to put you in. With this, you have to give them an opportunity to fold, and I think that's something. Especially check raising the flop is starting to pick up a little bit, but I think people are still not check raising nearly enough. You should be check raising more. Trust me, you should be check raising more than you're check raising. And I understand that they're not making any more good hands. They're not adding any more really valuable hands to the top of the chart. So if you're going to add check raising hands, you got to go down and you got to add some that you're not check raising for value. So, and also, if you're only check raising with sets and very strong draws, that's actually still not a very balanced range. Like, that's an incredibly strong range. If your draws are, big combo draws, strong draws. So just think about, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit here. Like, what are some other ways to balance that check raising range so that people are making a mistake when they fold to you? Because that's a great situation for you to be in, where you're giving them multiple ways to make a mistake. Most people, when they check raise, it's with, top or middle set, and when the opponent folds, they're making the correct decision. You've allowed them to do that. So check raising's one, just raising in position is another one. Depending on your opponent, you might choose to raise a turn instead if you have some information about them they're more likely to two barrel. That then you can sort of float that flop bet and take it away on a later street. But yeah, so String Bender, one of our other premium members, makes a point in here about check raise over c-betters quite heavily, even 25 to 50% of the time, which, I mean, it sounds crazy, but I think it's a good exploit. I've told this story before, but there's a guy that plays at a casino a little east of here that folds to 100% of check raises. So, and they'll still, in the multi-way position, in the multi-way pot, if they're in position, it goes check, 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 check. They'll always put a little stab bet out there for about 20, 25% pot. And they have folded every single time they have faced a check raise. So every time. And I hope they're not listening. Guy in the orange jacket. But yeah, it's
Sometimes you got to have the nuts, though, don't you? Like, just one time, don't you have to have the nuts? I don't know.
I mean, maybe he doesn't see, but maybe he doesn't make that stab.
Yeah,
right?
fair
Like, maybe he's like, oh, I've got the board crushed. I'm just gonna let them
Slow
bet
play
into
it.
me on the turn.
Yeah, he's gonna slow play it.
Yeah, which that I get that too, but yeah. So there's
Jim,
arguments for check raising with complete air, depending on who you're playing against. Yeah, maybe. So here, Binkley, you actually, or Eric. Sorry, I'm going to call you Binkley all night.
No, that's who I am on the forum. That's fine.
So talk to us a bit about your post here where you're talking about the difference of in position, out of position, and different kind of opponents.
Yeah, so basically, if you look at the theory, you're not supposed to c-bet 100% of the time. And it'll differ between if you're in position versus out of position. In position, it is a high frequency, maybe 80 to 90%. I don't know the exact numbers, but somewhere in there, and then but a bit lower. So 50 to 60% of the time if you're out of the position, and what you're 100% c-bet, what you're exploiting is that weaker players will just tendency to overfold. They won't defend properly. So you can go small with your c-bet, quarter pot, and they'll say, my ace high is no good, when, my gut shot's no good, which in fact, by theory, you are supposed to call a bit portion of that. So if you're 100% c-betting when you're in position, you are deviating, instead of 8, by 10 to 20%, but you're making that up by the exploit of your player pool. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when you do c-bet and they do continue, now you've folded out your villain's junk. They're going to continue with a stronger range, or they are a more experienced, more skilled player that is calling correctly. So now you can't assume that you're against a weaker player. So you're either against a player with a strong range or with a more skilled or a skilled player. So either way, you're going to have to proceed with caution. So one thing that I sometimes get myself into is leveling myself. It's like, oh, well, they know I'm 100% c-betting, so they're floating me.
Yes.
So I'm gonna fire the turn to make them fold again, and no, they have the nuts, and I just
Docked away
punt.
half your chips.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
So that's one thing you need to be careful of.
That's a very familiar feeling, Eric. for me.
Yeah, that's never happened to me.
Because you do feel like, because we project these attitudes and tendencies on these
Mhm.
players, right? And you're like, oh well, I would totally be doing this light here, so they must be, and like I'm gonna make them give it up on this next street, and they know your players. Like this is a big part of it. This poker is played between people at the table, real people making real decisions based on their own assumptions, and their take on who you are and what your assumptions are is what makes poker great. And so we can kind of out clever ourselves very easily by just putting our opponent in the wrong box and just saying, oh, they're doing this thing because they're on the level I'm on. And even if they're on a lower level than you, you're exploiting yourself by setting them up for a trap that they're not going to know not to walk into. And then they brought a club to a gunfight, but you didn't bring anything because you didn't think they were going to show up at all. So you really got to play your opponent, and whether that means not making the C bet, making the C bet and expecting to call a raise, making the C bet and expecting to have to re-raise on top, having a plan, 100% C bet can be an arrow in your quiver, but you have to have looked a little further down the road, I think, for how to play after that. The only other thing I want to say, Stringbender makes another great point in here, which is that it really depends on the position. If we're talking about if you're in late position and you're called by the button, then your C bets are going to get, the big blind. Thank you, Rob. Then your range advantage is going to be stronger than theirs than it would be in other circumstances. So you can C bet more frequently in that kind of situation because they're correct to fold more, which is a good point. So any closing thoughts? I know we like to zip in and out of these, a little taste of strategy to get you going on a Saturday. Does anyone else want to talk about C betting? I don't hear it. So failing that, I will so cleverly and professionally mention our sponsors for the second time today. I'd like to thank Website Amp, Learn Pro oh God, no, here we go. That sounds more like it. Learn Pro Poker, Website Amp, Running Aces, Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. Thanks, guys. Eric, Rob, Chris, and John. We will see you all next week.